All right, let's jump right into this explainer and tackle the grand illusions surrounding the ancient world's most famous repository of knowledge. When we think of the Library of Alexandria, we usually picture this gleaming beacon of ancient science tragically cut down in its prime by a sudden, catastrophic fire. It's a highly dramatic story, right? A perfect moral fable about the triumph of ignorance over reason. But as we're going to see today, the true history of this legendary institution is vastly different from the popular narrative. We are going to separate the historical facts from the persistent fictions and uncover what actually happened to the greatest collection of scrolls in antiquity.
Now, this quote perfectly captures a myth you see all over the internet today. The idea that humanity lost 1,000 years of scientific progress overnight. People still firmly believe that there is vast lost knowledge due to the library's burning, that we were literally on the brink of an industrial revolution with steam engines and advanced medicine, and that the loss of this single building entirely derailed human technological evolution. It's a fascinating narrative of an alternate universe for sure, but well, it's entirely built on a modern misunderstanding of what ancient science was and what this specific library actually did.
Section 1. Fact-checking the collection. To totally dismantle this dramatic theory, we first need to look closely at what the library actually was and, frankly, how big it truly grew. If we want to understand the scale of the loss, we absolutely have to start by getting realistic about the scale of the collection. The myths rely on the idea that the library contained practically all the wisdom of the ancient world under one roof. Popular claims, originating from highly exaggerated ancient sources, confidently state the library held a staggering 700,000 scrolls. Writers like Aulus Gellius and Ammianus Marcellinus passed down these massive figures, and they are repeated uncritically today. But historians warn us that ancient writers rarely had accurate statistics. They often just used giant numbers as rhetorical flourishes to basically mean a whole lot. Furthermore, without modern inventory systems, ancient librarians didn't exactly have the means or the time to count hundreds of thousands of individual items.
To put that into perspective, based on the number of known authors and rival libraries, the true count was a fraction of the myth. Historians like Roger S. Bagnall calculate that even if the library had multiple copies of every single known Greek author, the numbers wouldn't come anywhere close to 700,000. When we look at archaeological estimates for the Great Library of Pergamon, which was Alexandria's main rival, it held around 30,000 scrolls. It is highly unlikely Alexandria was 20 times larger than its biggest competitor. So a generous, realistic estimate puts the peak collection around 40,000 to 50,000 scrolls. Still the largest in the world at the time, but definitely not the 500,000 often claimed.
The reality is, the library wasn't an ancient MIT filled with engineers, but rather a hub for wealthy philosophers analyzing Homeric poetry. Greek proto-science was, highly abstract. They didn't conduct empirical experiments or invent submarines. Instead, the scholars at Alexandria were primarily focused on literature. They gathered variations of the Iliad and the Odyssey to establish definitive texts. If you actually look at the known head librarians, almost all of them specialized in grammar, epic poetry, and textual criticism. They weren't sketching flying machines, they were arguing over the exact wording of a verse by Pindar.
And this all makes sense when we look at the word Mousean, which is the root of our word museum, proving the library was an annex to a religious shrine, not a secular science lab. Popular culture often frames the library as a distinctly secular bastion of reason, standing bravely against religious superstition. But in reality, it was deeply intertwined with religion. It was dedicated to the Muses, goddesses of song, dance, and poetry, and was overseen by a priest appointed by the kings. The books were essentially a reference collection to service the scholars working at this specific religious shrine.
Section 2. Julius Caesar's Accidental Fire.
So the crucial point we need to ask is, if an angry mob didn't burn down a high-tech facility, who exactly set the famous fire? Well, the most well-documented destruction associated with the library actually comes from a purely political and military conflict, not some ideological war against knowledge. In 48 BCE, during a bitter civil war, Julius Caesar was besieged right in Alexandria, caught in a power struggle between Cleopatra and her brother. Cut off from the sea by the enemy fleet, Caesar made a split-second tactical military decision to set the ships in the dockyards on fire. This was meant as a diversion and a defense mechanism, but the wind carried the flames into the city, burning the docks and the nearby warehouses. Ancient sources indicate that a massive number of scrolls, perhaps waiting to be cataloged or just stored off-site, were destroyed in this totally accidental blaze. Now, while this loss of knowledge was certainly tragic, historical accounts show the institution itself survived Caesar's war and continued to operate. The fire of 48 BCE was a major blow, yes, but it was absolutely not the end. The museum and its library continued to be referenced by writers well after Caesar's time. Roman emperors like Claudius even built new annexes and continued to fund the scholars there. The library was wounded, but it was still very much alive going into the 1st century AD.
Section 3. The true, slow decline.
We all love a good catastrophe story, but the historical reality of how institutions die is usually much more mundane. The truth is, the library had gone a really long time in decline, suffering from issues that sound remarkably modern. It essentially died a slow death by 1,000 cuts over several centuries. Long before Caesar even arrived, King Ptolemy VIII purged the city's intellectuals during a political struggle in 145 BCE, stripping the institution of its prestige. Then came Caesar's fire in 48 BCE. Centuries later, in 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian brutally sacked the entire royal quarter where the Mausians stood during another military conflict. And, if that wasn't enough, a massive earthquake and tsunami in 365 AD quite literally submerged parts of the old royal city underwater.
The true culprits behind the library's demise were budget cuts, political instability, and general bureaucratic neglect. Libraries are incredibly delicate operations. They require immense, continuous financial patronage. You have to pay a massive staff to constantly copy, repair, and replace scrolls. Over the centuries, as Alexandria lost its political importance under Roman rule, that funding just dried up. The head librarian position stopped going to brilliant scholars and started going to political cronies and former military guards as a reward. Without funding, the books simply rotted away.
Later, politically charged myths blaming Christians or Muslims simply don't align with the historical evidence, as the books were likely already gone. In 391 AD, a Christian mob did destroy the Serapeum, a temple that once held a daughter library. But contemporary accounts of the riot make absolutely no mention of any books being destroyed, most likely because the collection had long since decayed from lack of funding. Similarly, a widely circulated story claims Arab forces burned the library's books as bathhouse fuel in 641 AD. Modern scholars uniformly reject this as a folktale, totally invented hundreds of years later for political purposes. Neither group destroyed the Great Library, because by the time they arrived, there was no Great Library left to destroy.
Section 4. The true takeaway.
So what should you take away from all this historical debunking? It's really easy to point fingers at a specific villain or a single dramatic fire, but the reality is far more sobering. The way we actually lose knowledge is a quiet process we need to be deeply aware of. As historian Roger S. Bagnall points out, without the constant, expensive funding required to copy and maintain decaying papyrus, knowledge simply fades away. Papyrus is super fragile. It falls apart from use, it gets eaten by mice, and it naturally breaks down over time. It doesn't matter if the building is perfectly safe from fire. If a society lacks the will, the peace, and the financial means to maintain the collection, the darkness sets in quietly. The Dark Ages weren't caused by the sudden destruction of a library. Rather, the slow fading of the library was a symptom of a society that could no longer support it.
I want to leave you with this final thought. The loss of knowledge is rarely a sudden fire, so we must ask ourselves if we are guilty of the exact same quiet neglect today. When we cut funding to archives, when we let digital infrastructure decay, or when we prioritize political appointments over actual expertise, we are repeating the true history of Alexandria. The myth of the catastrophic fire lets us off the hook. The reality of slow, bureaucratic neglect puts the responsibility squarely back on our shoulders. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this leaves you looking at our own modern repositories of knowledge in a whole new light.